Hey folks, Zach Osterman, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star. Trying something different. Going to try and bring this in through football season, and if it gets enough traction, we'll keep going through basketball season. But just periodic updates on YouTube. As you can see, this is, I guess, my home office. Nothing fancy, nothing overly technical, but just kind of a different way of delivering some of our coverage, some of our analysis of IU sports. We may even upload, when we do Mind Your Banners remotely, our podcast, Mind Your Banners, when we do it remotely, which is often, may even upload video from that on here, just so you can see our smiling faces, I suppose, if you'd like to sort of digest that in video form rather than audio. Basically, the idea here is not necessarily just going to be sort of, a stream of topics or just sort of a news rundown very often, though sometimes we may do that, especially in newsier times of year, like when basketball recruiting and the basketball preseason start to cross over into football season, or obviously the business into basketball season when there's a lot to talk about NCAA tournament seeding and Big Ten tournament seeding, things like that. But I think that primarily I'd like to use this for analysis and maybe just to sort of answer pressing questions, for lack of a better term. And the one I wanted to address today was Tom Allen's decision, which he only sort of formalized after Saturday's game, when he explained that when he told us he made a quarterback decision, and in fairness to Tom Allen, he didn't say he'd picked one over the other. He kind of hedged his bets with his wording. But when he told us he made a quarterback decision, he said it was either Tayven Jackson, that it was going to be Brendan Sorsby in week 1, Tayven Jackson in week 2, and that he was going to rotate between the both of them. Basically, that Indiana couldn't separate the two of them in fall camp, and Allen felt it only fair to give them the first 2 games of the season, and to basically use that as the final evaluation of which of these players should be Indiana's starting quarterback, beginning in week 3 against Louisville and moving forward, presumably, from there. There's been a lot of criticism of that, and I think some of it is understandable. I think some of it's probably just related to the loss. There is, of course, the old adage that if you have 2 quarterbacks, you don't have any quarterbacks. I do think in this particular case, I don't know that I would fully defend Tom Allen's thinking, but I do sort of understand his point, or at least his thought process. Number one, in what we were able to see of spring and fall camp, there really wasn't a lot of separation. There were moments when you felt like maybe Tayven Jackson was making a few more plays, or Brendan Sorsby looked a little bit more comfortable or consistent in one area. But there were never really moments in what we were privy to as the press where one was just clearly head and shoulders above the other. Number two, if you look at these 2 games, they are real extremes that Tom Allen is talking about. The Ohio State game being, the toughest home game Indiana in all likelihood will play this season, maybe the toughest game Indiana will play all year. We'll see what Ohio State shapes up, how Ohio State shapes up compared to the Michigans, the Penn States, etc. And then Indiana State, of course, which is a game that, with respect to the Sycamores, Indiana should be winning comfortably. And I think Allen's point was, in part, if I start one of these guys against Ohio State and then I sort of say he's got to go out and earn the job, well, that's an extreme sort of rubric to grade him against, and it sort of sets him up. You don't want to say this, but if Indiana struggles against Ohio State, which has happened many times in the past, it sets that player up to fail. So if you split these 2 games and you basically say you're going to get one very, very difficult conference game, you're going to get one non-conference game that should be fairly straightforward for Indiana. They'll both be at home. They're weeks 1 and 2, so you're not stretching the decision too deep into the season. Then you're still being equitable with both quarterbacks, essentially. And you're still giving each of them that opportunity to sort of prove themselves within the offense. And then the third thing I would say, in terms of, and this is me being in danger of maybe parsing Tom Allen's words a little too much, or putting words in his mouth, maybe to put it even more bluntly. It does feel like there's an extent to which, in Tom Allen's thinking, these first two games almost exist of a piece as kind of a preseason in a way. Again, one very difficult and in conference, one on paper less difficult and out of conference. But then starting with Louisville in week 3, I think that's when Tom Allen sort of thinks, this is where the season really needs to start gaining momentum. And, you think about, for example, a couple of years ago when Indiana opened with a clunker at Iowa and then came home and beat, I think it was Idaho. And you didn't feel like, of course, we know where Indiana's season ultimately wound up that year, but you didn't feel like either one of those games really lent a great feel to the direction of the season until we got further into it. I think Tom Allen is sort of thinking about Louisville in week 3 as the real sort of launch point of his season in a lot of ways. I think you maybe see that a little bit in play calling. I think you see that a little bit in, maybe how vanilla Indiana is keeping certain things. The idea being not that you're holding your entire playbook back just for Louisville, but that, you're not going to put too much on film when you think you've got some games coming up that could really decide the course of your season. And I would argue that 3-game stretch of Louisville, Akron, Maryland is a really, really big one and is going to set the course for the rest of the season. And that kind of brings me to, I think those are 3 things that, again, if I'm allowed to maybe infer some things from Tom Allen, I think those are 3 sort of parallel thought processes that led him to this decision to play Sorsby and Jackson relatively evenly over these first 2 games and then sort of make a decision and declare you are the starter, no more rotation, you are the backup, and that's the plan going forward. But there is this other question, and, both Mike Neislick and I have talked about this in what we've written. We've talked about this on Mind Your Banners. There is this other question of basically what Indiana wants to be offensively this year. And Tom Allen, for 6 years as head coach at Indiana, talked about wanting to run the football more and wanting to be better running the football than Indiana had been the previous year. And for 6 years, Tom Allen went out and found offensive coordinators that ran spread, no huddle offenses, spread one back, no huddle offenses that threw the ball all over the field. And typically when Indiana did have a good rushing piece to its offense, it was more based around the fact that it had a really sort of, tackle breaking back in Stevie Scott. It wasn't necessarily the scheme of the offense that was creating sort of big run opportunities. That was still slanting more toward the pass. What we saw on Saturday is a continuation of what we saw in the spring, of what we saw in the fall, what we tried to kind of tell you about in different ways without wanting to, sell out and be sure that that was what Indiana was going to do until we saw it. Indiana's running the triple option out of the gun. We saw Indiana with a lot of 2-back sets. We saw Indiana with a lot of what coaches call 22 sets, which is 2 running backs and 2 tight ends out of the shotgun. That's about as heavy as it gets in modern spread offense, to be running 2 tight ends and 2 running backs out of the gun. And so I think there's part of this quarterback decision, and again, Mike and I have both tried to talk about this in different ways, that is going to come down a little bit less to the individual skills of the quarterback and more to how those skills fit to what Indiana wants to be offensively. And I think often when we have looked at quarterback battles in the recent past for Indiana, we've tried to parse out basically, which guy is individually more talented than the other, competitor or the others. This year, I think it may be down to more Indiana saying, this is the offense. Which one of you functions better within it? And I think there is, I think there is some argument for that. In particular, that the option makes a lot of sense for Indiana. You can run it out of the shotgun. You absolutely can run it out of the air raid. It's just an extension or an expansion very often of what you hear people talk about, RPOs, run pass options a lot. It still puts a lot on the quarterback. There's a lot for a quarterback to process very quickly. There's a lot for a quarterback to have to decide just in a split second. There's keys he's got to read both pre and post snap that aren't that different from what you talk about in terms of maybe reading, pre and post snap coverages and getting the ball moving through the air to the right place very quickly. But I think the option makes sense for Indiana for a couple of reasons. Number one, Indiana's got a lot of talent in its offensive backfield. Christian Turner, in admittedly limited snaps, 7 carries for 29 yards. You could see why his teammates have been talking him up in the offseason. You know what Josh Henderson is if you're Indiana. You obviously know what Jalen Lucas is if you're Indiana. The option gets all those guys involved and keeps them involved. When you're running it out of the shotgun rather than maybe the old flex bone or the wing tee or anything like that, you don't isolate receivers quite as much because they aren't just kind of out on islands. You can move them around, you can shift them, you can motion them, you can get them more involved in the play. So you aren't necessarily punting your whole pass game, but the option is still sort of the core of your offense, even out of the gun. You're making the most of a really talented backfield. Number two, you've got a really good defense this year if you're Indiana. And I think whatever comes of this offense, I think we can all look at it and say it's not just going to sort of, find some unholy rhythm in the first 3-4 weeks and just start scoring points for fun. Maybe I'm wrong. But it's an offense that I think we can all recognize, even against teams that are lesser opponents than Ohio State, is going to have to feel its way into the season a little bit, not least, of course, at quarterback. And so if you've got a good defense and an offense that's going to, take some time and be a bit of a work in progress, one of the things you can do, especially in a year where the clock rules have changed, the clock moves a lot faster now. It doesn't stop between first downs. Even if you're going to go hurry up, even if you're going to go spread, you can still eat more clock, even on shorter drives. And Mike and I talked about that on the podcast this past weekend as well. Running the option, running the ball in general is going to allow you to shorten games, is going to allow you to rest a defense that looks like it may be a bit of a game changer for Indiana. We'll see. It's only 1 week. We don't want to draw too many conclusions, of course, but may have the potential to sort of be a game-changing unit again for Indiana, as well as it played against Ohio State. Well, that rests guys. That not only keeps them fresh in games, but it keeps them healthier over the course of a season. How many times in the last 2 years have we talked about Indiana's defense basically just being too worn down in the last 4 or 5 weeks of a season to be as effective as it looked like it might be earlier in the fall? And so, suddenly you got an offense that maybe can control the clock a little bit more, control the tempo of the game a little bit better than what Indiana was able to do last year when it was just trying to run it at breakneck speed and just wasn't able to consistently find a passing rhythm that allowed it to do that. And then the third thing I would say, as someone who has always been intrigued by the idea of bringing option football, true option football, to the Big Ten. And it's not like no one's ever tried it. Different coaches with different schemes have input, sort of tried to put their imprint on it in different ways. You think about Rich Rodriguez at Michigan as an example, and he wasn't running maybe what you recognize as the most sort of straightforward form of the triple, but he was running, just a very sort of quarterback option-based offense. Sometimes it's worked, sometimes it hasn't. But the third thing I would say is it makes Indiana distinct. It makes Indiana a different sort of challenge to prepare for. And as we've said many times over the years, when Indiana has struggled against Ohio State, most teams aren't Ohio State. Most teams aren't Ohio State in terms of athleticism, in terms of experience, in terms of talent, in terms of depth. I went and looked at this today because often what you'd find, for example, when Paul Johnson was running his a truer, and it was a truer triple option in terms of, it was kind of, I've heard people call that the flex bone. I've heard people call it the wing T. And when we ran it in high school, we called it the wing T. But he was running it out of a more traditional option formation. Now, it was still inspired by a lot of spread offense concepts that he picked up, I think, from June Jones at Hawaii. But it was run out of a more sort of traditional option formation. One of the things that sometimes gave Georgia Tech trouble when they ran the triple under Paul Johnson was coming up against teams after a bye week. And basically, if you had 2 weeks to prepare for the option, it made an enormous difference in how just sort of ready and how disciplined your defense was. Because defense, the reason you run the option is to force defenders to make wrong decisions. You're constantly spreading defenses out. You're constantly basically giving them 3-4 keys to read at any one time, especially if Indiana can start layering some true RPO plus triple option stuff into this, which, listen, that's a lot of moving parts, but it's not unheard of. The idea that you could hand it off, you could pull it and run, you could pitch, or you can throw. Indiana starts running some of that stuff. teams do a lot better, just statistically, history tells us, when they have 2 weeks to prepare for teams that run that kind of offense rather than one. And I looked this up today. It's over here. Indiana still plays Maryland, Michigan, Rutgers, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan State, Purdue, and Penn State this season. That's the balance of Indiana's Big Ten schedule. Indiana does not play a single team by my count and my scrolling through the conference composite schedule that will be coming into Indiana week off a bye. Every single team left on Indiana's schedule, Indiana's Big Ten schedule specifically, will play the week before they play Indiana. So if you do something that is totally different from what these teams are preparing for the week before they play Indiana, and then they have to maybe sprinkle these concepts in across the course of a few weeks and then just sort of crash course them over the course of 3 or 4 days of practice before they prepare for Indiana, that is a lot to ask. And that will be a struggle for a lot of teams that aren't Ohio State. In fact, Indiana plays 3 teams this season, Wisconsin, Michigan State, and Penn State, that all play Ohio State the week before they play Indiana. So you're not just getting the advantage of no opponents coming off of bye weeks. You're also getting the advantage of some opponents coming off of what should be, physically draining games, physically demanding games, etc. So this is all a way of me, I guess, basically advocating that Indiana should keep running the triple in some form out of the shotgun, out of Walt Bell's air raid offense. Again, that's not unheard of. That is absolutely something that teams do. Maybe not quite to the sort of level that Indiana was running, something that looked like, if you were running out of the shotgun, the pure as the driven snow triple option on Saturday. And again, remember, Indiana was keeping some things very vanilla in that game, both for its quarterbacks and also just to try and not throw everything out on the field in week one. No matter who you're playing in week one, you're going to want your offense to show evolution as the season goes on. And so you're not going to put it all on tape right away. But that's basically me sort of advocating for Indiana continuing on this path as long as it can, in terms of its running back depth, in terms of its line depth, and in terms of basically picking a quarterback that is better in that system. And whether you agree with it or not, Tom Allen has given himself added time to figure out who that quarterback is. I think you saw some good from each of these guys last weekend. To the naked eye, Tayven Jackson looked a little bit more comfortable, a little bit smoother, not just in the option in general, but in terms of maybe how comfortable he was in traffic, the way he moved away from pressure, how decisive he was in his reads, how decisive he was in, times when he decided to pull the ball and run, when he pitched it, when he kept it, those kinds of things. But it was a small sample size. Indiana only ran, I think, 54 offensive plays. So let's not, that's not the whole Bible by any means. It will be really interesting. Tayven Jackson gets to start on Saturday to see what these two quarterbacks do against an Indiana State team that obviously poses a very different challenge. And again, you can criticize it. I understand people who disagree with it. But I do understand where Tom Allen is coming from, and I think that ultimately this quarterback decision may come down, as much as anything, to which of these players fits what Indiana wants to do the most, rather than maybe Indiana looking at the players and saying, this one clearly has a leg up, is clearly sort of above or ahead of that one, so we're going to fit the offense to his strengths. We'll see. It'll be interesting. In the meantime, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching our first video. Again, we'll be doing more of these as football season and certainly as basketball season unfold. Please hit subscribe on the YouTube channel, and we will have these for you pretty regularly, I would say, across the coming weeks and months. For the Indianapolis Star, I'm Zach Osterman. We'll talk to you soon.